All right, Burnsville Psych. Today we're going to be talking about Piaget. Piaget is probably one of the big names in developmental psychology. Piaget was a biologist by trade, later starts working his way into psychology and studying the way that kids think. So in terms of Piaget's stage theory, which is first of our stage theories, he talks quite a bit about the thought processes and how children's brains develop. So, thus, cognitive development. Anytime we think cognitive, we think thinking. So Piaget is an interesting guy, and we can get into some of his ideas. In the book, you should read about assimilation and accommodation, which are basically the ways that we take in new information and how we go through the process of building schema. I know in Media Lit, I think Media Lit, talk about schema and how that works. Piaget was one of the first to kind of explain how that process happens in kids. Couple of quick things before we launch into this stage theory. First thing, he says that um, basically kids go through the stages in the same order. So if you're super smart, that doesn't mean you like skip a grade and skip up to stage 2 right off the bat. Um, you go through this process in the same order as everybody else. What might vary is the age ranges and the averages. So we're going to see that the first stage is birth to 2 or birth to 1.5, depending on how you define things. And depending on where you are, you might see, I think the one that pops up really is in the pre-operational stage. That number 7 is probably a little on the late end. So we can talk about that as well. But for now, knowing that these are averages and that from child to child you'll see some variation, maybe from culture and experience, you'll see variation. Some kids have experiences that get them developing maybe, uh, I guess, more rapidly than others. So, Piaget, when we're talking about cognitive development, Piaget says that between birth and 2 or birth and about 1.5 years old, babies are in something called the sensory motor stage. In the sensory motor stage, um, we are basically limited to reflex behaviors, simple motor responses, and that actually makes tons of sense based off of what we studied in physical development. We talked about babies' language development being reflexive. So it should be no surprise that, in terms of thinking, it's the same kind of simple reflexive responses is what they're capable of. They only understand the world through their direct experience. And I typed in a word here, egocentric. Babies are completely egocentric, which means that they can only see things through their own lens. They don't understand that other people might have a different viewpoint or a different attitude or a different idea. Okay, so if you're egocentric, what that means is that you have this feeling that you and only you are the center of the universe, and whatever you need comes first. What happens when a baby's hungry? They cry until you give them food. They don't understand. Oh, give me a minute and hold on because I have to, warm up the bottle. They don't understand that because they're egocentric. Um, so that's a key part to understanding how babies think and how they operate. Because of the fact that babies have pretty limited experience of the world, their cognitive development is also limited. Starting at around 1.5 or 2, there is a concept that pops up for kids called object permanence. And this is kind of the way I think about this. This is what moves someone from sensory motor to the next stage, pre-operational. As soon as a child understands object permanence, now they move into the pre-operational stage. So babies do not understand object permanence, which is why peekaboo is fun. Once we get to object permanence, children understand that um, if I take their toy, let's say a rattle that they like to play with, and I cover it with a blanket, if you understand object permanence, you know that the rattle is still there, it's just underneath the blanket. Babies think that you made it disappear. This is why peekaboo is a fun game to babies. When you cover up your face, they literally think that somehow you made yourself disappear, which seems crazy, but that's where they're at in terms of cognitive development. So object permanence, the idea that we can form mental images. This is important in terms of the development of your thinking, because now you can start to represent things in the world through imagery or through other symbols. Think of language. What are we doing? We're coming up with lots of labels for objects that are symbolic. Babies are egocentric. Kids in the pre-operational stage are still largely egocentric and see things from their own point of view and have a hard time understanding other people. So the behavior of a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, what does it look like? They are not very good at sharing. Why not? Because if I'm egocentric and the world is set up for me, why should I share the toy? I'm the only one that matters, therefore I get the toy. If you've ever been around children, you will watch them together, and one child will walk up to another and just grab a toy right out of their hand, and they don't think anything of it. Don't think that it's mean or rude or wrong, because I'm egocentric and the world should be set up to make me happy. Once you know this about kids, it helps explain some of the behaviors, and at least in my mind, makes it not quite as obnoxious. Okay, so once we get to around, I'm going to say probably age 5 or 6 is probably more like it now. Kids will move into the concrete operations stage. Concrete operations, probably about 6 is a good age. Kids are able to perform mental operations. They can take care of thinking tasks in their head. Prior to age 6, if you have a child and you're going to have them do math, like addition, they have to have some tangible object that they can arrange and then count the objects. By the time you get to concrete operations, Piaget says that you can start to do that work in your head. So I don't need to literally count the objects to do addition. I can start to handle that mentally. This is going to be important. Think about what happens once you get to age 6 or 7. You start working into the primary grades in elementary school, and suddenly now the work you're doing is more academic. Prior to that, kindergarten is a lot of learning routines and getting along, and some very basic skills, some basic linguistic skills, pre-linguistic stuff in terms of literacy. But for the most part, you're just getting warmed up. Once we get to concrete operations, now we are able to do some of the other work that we need to do. Piaget talks about a couple of ideas, reversibility and conservation. And these are basically ways of thinking. So in terms of reversibility, if we are thinking through the steps of a task or through a process, we can reverse the direction of our thought and go backwards. If I add 2 plus 3, I can take 3 or 5 and subtract 3 and get back to 2, if that makes sense. We can go forwards and backwards in our thinking. Conservation is the idea that objects or quantities remain the same despite a change in their physical appearance. So this works best if we can see what we're talking about. The classic conservation task is this. We have 2 glasses of water here that are the same amount. We take glass B and pour it into this other container, which obviously has a different shape. So now kids will compare the water, and they say, well, the water over here is much lower than the water over here. This water is taller, therefore there's more water here. You can do this right in front of the child, and they will choose the tall glass every time if they have not yet developed conservation, probably before age 6. Once you get to the concrete operation stage, you can do these kinds of things and it should not be a problem. Prior to that point, kids will make this mistake, and it is mind-boggling when they do this. Now, conservation does not have to be about volume or liquid. It could be any other way that we think about how objects can change. This is a real simple task. If you took, let's say, coins, and you have one grouping that is kind of tight and compact, and then you have another group that's really spread out, the kids will say, well, there's less here than here, because in the bottom grouping that's all spread out, there seems to be like more because it takes up more space. Now this doesn't, there's no logic to this, but that's the way that they would answer that question prior to concrete operations. Last stage here we have is called formal operations. Formal operations is, it says 11 to 16, so think kind of junior high on up once you get into secondary. The thinking that is possible here becomes more complicated and more developed again. You can think about the future, things that are abstract, things that are hypothetical, deductive reasoning. The thinking is more complicated. Kids are able to get beyond egocentrism and see different points of view. One of my favorite words, metacognition, is possible at this point. Thinking about your thinking. So how did I approach that problem? Could I have done things differently? That kind of thinking is possible once we get to formal operations. This is also notably where Piaget says that moral judgment starts to kick in and starts to become developed. So what does that mean? Prior to age 11, if Piaget is right, kids are not really capable of having their own inner value system or their own sense of moral judgment. So the reason they will do what is right or avoid doing what is wrong is not because they know it intrinsically, but because they fear getting punished from their parents. So again, that idea that a 4-year-old is going to share because it's the right thing to do, that kind of thinking is impossible for small children. We will do more with moral judgment later when we talk about Lawrence Kohlberg, who was one of Piaget's students. So if we can do a quick wrap up here, when we talk about these stages and the changes that happen over time, we are talking about how our brains develop in terms of the kinds of thinking we're capable of. And over time, as we move from sensory motor to pre-operational to concrete operations to formal operations, the thinking becomes more and more complex, and we are capable of more complicated and abstract kinds of work. That is it for today. Thanks for tuning in.